Welcome back, listeners, to another episode of the History Blokes, the podcast where we discuss key events, people, and fun facts about Australian history we think you ought to know. I'm Chris McComb.
And I'm Conan Elphick.
And we're talking to you now from Ngunnawal country here in Canberra. Okay, Conan, well, what do we have in store for us tonight?
Very exciting story today, Chris. It is, of course, about Matthew Flinders, an explorer. In fact, one of Europe's greatest explorers, certainly England's greatest explorers, and he doesn't get much credit for that.
That's interesting because we all kind of are aware of him from school.
Yeah.
We're aware of his Australian feats, but in a very general sense.
Yeah, that's right. 222 years ago this month, Matthew Flinders was given command of the HMS Investigator, with which he became the first person to circumnavigate Australia, and basically the first person to map it comprehensively. He also coined, pretty much, I'm qualifying some of this, because we'll get to it, but he pretty much coined the term Australia. His life was one of ups and downs, a bit of unpleasantness, but now, didn't you go to Flinders University?
I did go to Flinders University.
So I imagine you know all about Matthew
There's
Flinders.
a little ship there as a motto.
Is there?
Yeah, absolutely. Flinders University, a fine establishment to help you navigate your way through life.
Yeah.
If it wasn't a motto, it should.
But it sounds to me like you don't know much about the man himself.
Not a lot, actually.
Okay,
not a lot.
Let's remedy that.
Before you go on, Conan, we should also mention to our listeners that we now have an Instagram account, and you can find us at History Blokes, all one word, on Instagram. Look out for our fun and frivolous photos and films that we're likely to put up in the next couple of weeks.
Things are going to get raucous. Anyway, but before we get into the material itself, as usual, Chris, I'm going to subject you to the quiz, because the first question is about Matthew Flinders. What was the name of his cat?
I'm going to say Mr. Fluffy.
Chris, you could not be more wrong. The rest of the questions are about big cats. The tenuous connection being that I've just asked you a cat question. So, Chris, the term big cats is a loose one, but strictly speaking, there are only 4. All belonging to the genus Panthera, which can be interbred should the whim take you.
You'd like me to name them, of course.
Of course I want you to name them.
Okay, so we're going to go for lion, leopard, we're going to go for tiger. Oh, the other one's getting a little bit tricky. You can kind of, do you go cheetah?
No.
Or do you go puma? Okay, hit me
So
with the last
3
one.
out of 4. No, you're going to have to wait to the end. I'm going to make you suffer. You should know this. Everyone should know what the 4 big cats are. So this is a trickier question. What can the 4 big cats do that other cats cannot?
What can the 4 big cats do that other cats cannot? That's a good question. I don't know.
Okay, no, where are you at? No, it's a hard question. No, this another one. This sort of requires you to know the 4th one, which you didn't. Which I now tell you it's a jaguar.
Jaguar. Oh, I see. Yes, okay. Fair enough.
For the 4th question, 3 of the 4 big cats kill by throttling their prey. The exception is the jaguar. How does it kill?
That's a very good question. I have no idea.
No.
I mean,
no one would imagine they would kill in a different way.
No, I agree. Tear them to pieces with its claws and its fangs.
Well, I imagine there's a bit of tearing to pieces, but that's not the main way they do it. A mountain lion goes by 2 other names.
Okay, so now I'm going to say puma.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I get to that at the end, and then you'll kick yourself. Okay, now let's get into Flinders. Now, Matthew Flinders was born in 1774 in Lincolnshire, and you'll be thrilled to know, Chris, I'm not going to do a Lincolnshire accent at any point.
It's a shame. I was hoping you'd do the entire podcast in that accent, so as we can thoroughly offend anyone from that part of the world.
Yes.
That's important.
Yeah. Now, he was inspired by reading Robinson Crusoe as a child, and he joined the Navy as a midshipman, the most junior officer. Often back in the 18th century, basically children who would join the Navy, who came from the middle classes, would do so as a midshipman. Sometimes, 12, 13, 14. So
wouldn't it be frustrating if you're, like a 45-year-old
Yes.
sailor and you're taking your orders from a child?
Yes, whose voice is barely broken.
Very frustrating. Very
Yeah.
frustrating.
I don't think it was easy being a midshipman trying to command, say, 20 or 30
And nor should it
burly
be.
sailors.
You're a child.
You're a child, yeah. It's insane. But so they basically did their apprenticeship as officers before they then had to take an exam and become a lieutenant. So he was 15 when he joined, and 2 years later he served under, of all people, William Bligh. Chris, your best mate.
Oh my goodness. He keeps coming up in these podcasts, for sure. He just seems to be entwined in Australian history somewhere. It just keeps popping up like a bad apple.
So Bligh was a very good navigator. So he would have taught Flinders his navigation skills.
Hopefully he didn't teach him his interpersonal skills as well. No mutinies for Flinders.
But apparently Bligh was a bit better behaved on this expedition. He had learned his lesson and he wasn't quite as shouty as on the first one. Although apparently Flinders disliked him because he didn't give Flinders enough credit for some of the charting Flinders did on that expedition. So in 1795, so he would have been 21, Flinders decided to sail to Sydney with a view to doing exploration around this neck of the woods. And en route, he met a gentleman by the name of George Bass. And that name may ring a bell.
It certainly does.
Yeah.
He was a pretty straight-up guy, wasn't he?
So they befriended each other on the way to Sydney. And then they explored Botany Bay and the Georges River and stuff like that, and Lake Illawarra, just in an open boat, just the two of them.
Almost romantic, going for a little bit of a row round Botany Bay.
Well, who knows? Who's to say it wasn't like that? Yes, and then subsequently, a couple of years later, Governor John Hunter gave Flinders, who was now promoted to lieutenant, command of a sloop called Norfolk, and with that he and Bass circumnavigated Van Diemen's Land.
It's my favourite type of ship, a sloop.
Is it? Why is it?
Just like the word.
Sloop. It's a nice word. So, therefore they were the first Europeans to demonstrate that it was an island. And Flinders named the strait after his mate, or according to you, his lover. But I hasten to add that he did not name Flinders Island after himself. That was done later.
That would have been just a little bit too much self-aggrandizement.
Yeah. Then after exploring some of the Queensland coast, Flinders returned to England in 1800. And there he published a book with the typically long title of the age. It was called Observations on the Coasts of Van Diemen's Land, on Bass's Strait and its island, and on part of the coasts of New South Wales. Now, despite this very long title, Chris, it won him some acclaim. And on the basis of this, he was able to persuade Sir Joseph Banks to support his proposal, Flinders' grand vision of exploring the entire Australian coast, which of course had never been done. It's probably safe to say that no Indigenous people would have done this. Right, so I don't think we need to say that the first Europeans did this. They, got about in canoes. I don't think it would have been even possible to circumnavigate the entire continent
and map it.
And so they certainly would have mapped
Absolutely.
it. And why would they want to?
Exactly.
I mean, it's a little bit hard to know what motivated him. He might have just been one of these crazy people who just love to explore. It might have been a desire just to make his name and rise up through the ranks.
It's also a way, by supporting a mission like that, it's also a way in some respects of opening it up. What are the resources? What does it look like? What are the...
Yeah, exactly. That was the Admiralty's point of view. So they were worried about the French. They knew that the French had designs on Australia, or at least they thought they did. And look, they were probably right, because another explorer, Nicholas Baudon, was exploring the coast of Australia at the same time that Flinders did. And Banks knew that Baudon was on his way.
So, a great race.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. So the Admiralty approved it, financed the expedition. They promoted him to commander and gave him command of the Investigator, as I mentioned before, in February 1801. And so the idea was that he would sail straight from the UK to the west coast. In particular, he was asked to chart what was called then the unknown coast, the sort of eastern part of the Great Australian Bight. So part of the reason why your university was named after him was because what is now South Australia was a big focus of his
he
efforts.
kind of worked his way into every sort of wiggle, didn't he, around the coastline?
Well, up to a point. I mean, he was limited, so we need to make it clear that this was not a complete comprehensive map, but it was much better than had been produced before. And of course, a lot of we go into this. I don't want to preempt myself. You're dragging me off course, Chris.
You need a navigator.
Yes, I do. So one of the purposes of the expedition was also to ascertain whether or not New Holland, the western part of Australia, and New South Wales, the eastern part, were the same continent, because this was 1801. Europeans still did not know. Now, the Investigator was not a large vessel, Chris. It was only 33 metres long by 8 wide, and it was like James Cook's ships. It was a collier. In other words, it was used to carry coal, really just sort of around the coast of the UK.
It's a very sturdy ship.
The rather sad thing is, Chris, he married a woman called Anne Chappell, also from Lincolnshire, 3 months before he set sail. And the idea was that he would take her with him. But the Admiralty overruled that unfortunately.
Yeah, at least that's what he told us. Oh, I'm sorry, my dear.
Yes.
I'm so sorry. We're off to Tahiti and all these exotic places.
And they knew that they would be separated for some time. He thought it would be for about 4 years. It turned out to be 9 years. Yeah.
So they were married for 3 months, and then he buggers off for 9 years. Jeepers creepers.
And obviously for doing that,
that's tough.
She knew that he was going to be doing exploration work, which is inherently dangerous. So she wouldn't have heard from him for potentially months, years on end.
I mean, there was several generations of, let's face it, women, wives left home at Old Blighty, never knowing if they were going to see their sailor or explorer husbands again.
But he did take Trim, the cat. That
Trim
was the answer
the cat.
to the first question.
I can't believe this is even written down somewhere.
Not only is it written down, there are statues of Trim around the place. There's one next to the Mitchell Library in Sydney, just of the cat, not of Flinders.
So any of you Sydney-siders, get down there and check it out.
Yeah, he was devoted to the cat. He'd actually come across it as a kid a couple of years before on board a ship. But yeah, so he took it back to the UK, and from there, it accompanied him on all of his travels.
Couldn't take his wife, but he could take the cat.
Yeah, so anyway, so he sailed from England in July 1801. It took him nearly 6 months just to get to Point Lewin in Australia's southwestern tip. And from there, the excitement began, Chris. So he headed east and arrived in Fowler's Bay in South Australia. Does that mean anything to you? That's I think it's just west of Adelaide or Spencer Gulf. So it's a series of little bays and gulfs. So Fowler's Bay, Spencer Gulf, Gulf St Vincent, all sort of there. South Australian listeners are probably horrified. He also explored Kangaroo Island and then, of course, went east, following his instructions to carefully map what was then the unknown coast. And it was in the course of that he came across Baudon, Nicholas Baudon, who this was in April 1802.
Was it cannons at 80 paces? What happened?
No, it was a friendly encounter because they were not at war at this point.
Oh, I see.
So there was rivalry, but
this is just prior to the war breaking out, wasn't it?
The war plays a role. The Napoleonic Wars do play a role in Flinders' life. At this point, it was all very cordial. Baudon was annoyed to discover, of course, that Flinders had already mapped a great deal of what he had been sent to map himself. But they were gentlemen, they were gracious. Flinders gave him some advice on where to find water and food, namely Kangaroo Island, and they parted best of friends. And then Flinders...
It's kind of a nice story, isn't it?
It is a nice story, yes.
For sure. There should be plays made about that interaction.
Yeah. A short play.
Short play, that's right.
So Flinders then went to Sydney, and interestingly, he soon met Baudon again, because the Frenchman, his crew were incapacitated by scurvy and dysentery and God knows what else. So And again, the English treated him well. He had only good things to say about it.
It all seems very civilised, doesn't
civilised,
it? Absolutely.
Yeah. So after a bit of a break, Flinders set off in July 1802, heading north. Interestingly, he took a couple of Aboriginal blokes with him, and it's important to add that they went voluntarily. He didn't sort of nab them. So one was called Bungaree, and the other one's Nambury.
I've seen images of this gentleman, actually. Yeah.
But he was actually essential because Bungaree obviously wouldn't have spoken the languages of Aboriginal people up the Queensland coast, because a lot of Queensland had not been mapped, and that's what Flinders was very keen on doing. They obviously had to get close inshore, they had to replenish. You needed to be able to get on with the local people. That's where Bungaree in particular was really handy. He was just a very good negotiator. So what he would actually do is he would whip off his gear so that it was very clear that he was Aboriginal. And he understood the protocols, the social protocols of approaching other people's country. So he was able to avoid armed conflict. Yeah.
What a smooth move by Flinders.
Yeah, no, it was very wise. So Nambury returned. They came across another ship off Queensland, and Nambury got sick of the whole thing and went back to Sydney. But Bungaree stayed with the expedition the entire way round. He and Flinders and the rest of the crew were the first people
circumnavigated Australia.
Yeah, and he doesn't get much credit.
I think there's kind of a wonderful story there about kind of doing it together. You know what I mean?
That's
I
right.
think that's actually brilliant.
The way Flinders describes him was as having a good disposition and open and manly conduct.
That's the highest level of compliment.
I would be thrilled if someone said that of me. I'm not sure they would.
Don't be so hard on yourself, Conan. Or maybe not.
I don't think I'm any of those things, to be honest.
Maybe not in that shirt.
The shirt for you listeners is a beautiful sort of Hawaiian arrangement.
I
floral
said maybe
thing,
more
floral.
Tahitian.
Yeah, it's more
I know,
Tahitian.
It's wonderful.
I thought it was fitting.
Yeah, it is. It's very summery.
Yeah, sort of thing you would wear if you were exploring the Pacific. So Flinders carefully mapped the southern Queensland coast, then passed through Torres Strait into the Gulf of Carpentaria. And there it became clear that the Investigator was in terrible shape. It was badly leaking, it was half rotten. So this is a great word, they careened it. Have you heard that term? That's where you just run it up into the
run
beach.
it into the sand. Yeah, absolutely.
And then you check it out and go, oh. It was on that basis. So the idea was that they were going to circumnavigate Australia back to Point Lewin and from there return to the UK. But Flinders realised he wasn't going to be able to, it wasn't seaworthy enough. He thought he could probably get away with circumnavigating Australia anti-clockwise and then come back to Sydney. And it also meant that he had to do a bit of a rush job on certain parts of Australia. So this is part of the reason why it's not a complete map. It's reasonably complete, but there were certain inlets he would otherwise have been able to go into.
You know what I'm picturing? This map of Australia, and then suddenly dotted line, and then another long line, then another dotted line.
I mean, you can Google the Flinders map, and you'll see that actually is a little bit the case.
Yeah, and at the end of that dotted line, you could put sea monsters and giants walking along the shore. Use your imagination, just like the seafarers of old.
Yeah. Well, he should have, because of course he didn't go inland. I mean, obviously the vast majority of the landmass was to Europeans completely unknown. I would have had fun. He doesn't have my rich sense of humour.
Clearly not. Would have been a much more jolly voyage had they had someone like you on board, Conan.
Yes,
I have no doubt.
Yes. Thank you, Chris.
My pleasure.
So, yes, now it should be pointed out, of course, that a lot of the Australian coast had already been charted. By who, Chris?
The West Australian coast?
Yep.
Yeah, the Dutch.
Yeah, and they, not just the West Australia, they had charted much of the north coast as well, including the Gulf of Carpentaria.
Oh, of course, because the Dutch were, in fact, probably the first Europeans to actually make landfall in Australia in 1606 on the Doifkin.
Yep, very good.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I sailed that ship.
Have you
Not
really?
the original, of course. I sailed a replica of that ship.
You sailed it. I've been on it, because it's on the National Maritime Museum.
Yeah, it's spectacular. It's really cool. Yeah.
But you've sailed it. Wow. That would have been cool. How long were you at sea on
About
that?
a month.
Did you get... It must have been very claustrophobic. It's a tiny vessel.
They had some innovations that weren't around at the actual time of the original Doifkin, such as hammocks, which didn't invent those until sort of the 1700s, where I think they brought them back from Mexico or somewhere like that. And they obviously didn't have a wheel as well. Not that we had one on ours, just the whipstaff.
Yeah,
and
it's like a tiller, right?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Exactly. So it would look an amazing experience. I'd recommend anyone who has an interest in sailing, see if you can get a volunteer experience on a tall ship. Absolutely brilliant.
That would be amazing. Yeah, anyway, so he returned to Sydney pretty much a year after he left, on the 9th of June. Scurvy and dysentery plagued the crew. Several had died of illness and other causes. But it had been an amazing feat of navigation, Chris. He'd circumnavigated the entire country, the first person to do it.
Could I just check, though? An amazing feat of navigation, or just keep the land on your left-hand side.
Yes, although yes,
I think you're building it up a little bit too much here, Conan.
You think I should be downplaying his
I think so,
achievements?
a little, just a little. Yeah.
So anyone could have done it, really.
Yeah, that's right. Just takes the gloss off him.
Yeah. So he abandoned the Investigator in Sydney, and then he set sail as a passenger on HMS Porpoise. But unfortunately, so this is one of the
HMS Porpoise.
It's not a porpoise. It's a porpoise. Do you seriously say porpoise?
No. I've heard it and it's funny.
Some people say tortoise.
Tortoise.
Some people say tortoise.
Some people are idiots.
Some people are idiots. Okay, so unfortunately the ship struck a reef off Queensland. Before the ship sank, everyone was able to no one was killed, everyone found refuge on a nearby island, but Flinders navigated one of the ship's boats 1,127 k's back to Sydney to arrange for the rescue of the other 94.
And listeners, when Conan says navigate, he means keep land on the right.
Pay no attention, Matthew. Now, the new governor, who was Philip Gidley King, complied with Admiralty orders by helping Flinders in every possible way, and he gave him command of the schooner Cumberland. Now, a schooner is a small, if you know what a schooner is, it's not a large vessel, it's pretty small. He took command of this, and he found en route back to the UK that this too was barely seaworthy. And I'm not sure why this wasn't clear beforehand, but so he was forced to seek help at Mauritius, what was then called the Isle de France. Now, unfortunately, what he was unaware of was that war had broken out between the English and the French. So when he arrived there, the French governor, who was called General Charles Decaen, was not pleased to see him.
So he came in expecting a friendly seafarer's welcome, and instead was thrown in irons?
No, he wasn't thrown in irons, but the Frenchman was rude to him. He called him an imposter. So he was accusing him of being a spy, basically, which was almost certainly not true. So we do know that Flinders handled the situation badly. He wasn't particularly tactful. Cairn was a bit paranoid. So they clashed. In fact, Baudin had died in Mauritius not long before Flinders arrived. And Baudin had said to De Caen, look, Flinders is a great guy. He helped me out at Encounter Bay, and the English are generally very nice. They helped me out in Sydney. So just be nice to Flinders if he turns up. And Cairn just paid no attention.
That's a shame. Whilst his mate, of course, is as dead as a dodo.
Yes. Oh my God, that was... No, I mean, that was actually pretty good. That was pretty good. Just... Jesus Christ. Okay, your jokes, mate. Jesus Christ.
They're coming, mate. They're coming.
They can just sort of... A river of gold. It's a river... Oh dear. Poor Flinders. Flinders was held on Mauritius for 6 years.
6 years?
Yeah.
My goodness.
De Caen was actually received orders from Napoleon to release him, but he did not comply. Part of this was due to the animosity between the two men, but he was also worried that Mauritius was very poorly defended, and that Flinders would reveal this which he would have done, to the Admiralty. So that was a legitimate concern. But 6 years is a long time. Now, he wasn't in irons. He was allowed to roam the island at will, because back in those days, an officer would give his parole. So basically swear not to. And Flinders did have opportunities to escape, but out of sheer honour, he didn't. Look, and he put the time to good use. He formed close friendships. He worked on his book.
I mean, you kind of hope so. 6 years is a long bloody time.
Yes.
What did you do? Yeah, I just caught up on Netflix, watched a couple of shows.
Yeah, so he worked up his book. And the book was hugely important to him, and that was part of the problem. He knew that the book, which was about his exploration, which was a significant feat, as I've said, it would make his name. But it wasn't going to make his name until it was in print, and it wasn't going to be in print until he got to the UK with it. So he was stuck. He wasn't able to pursue his naval career. He wasn't able to get his book published. He couldn't see his wife, and in fact, he couldn't even spend too much time with his cat because Trim vanished.
The cat left.
Well,
disappeared. The cat disappeared.
It disappeared. It didn't necessarily leave. Look, he just vanished, and I think that was fairly early on in his exile.
Oh, tragic for him, really.
We do know that Flinders was feeling very low during this period. Like, it really got to him because he didn't know when he was going to be released, and people died young then, and people died a lot on places like Mauritius. He envisaged
disease would have been rife, and
as I said, Baudin died there. It's probably I think it was of TB.
So you never knew when your ticket to be punched. Eh?
That's right.
Yeah,
grim. So it was only when the British fleet blockaded the island in 1810.
In an effort to get him back.
No, it wasn't that popular. Yeah, that eventually he was released. It must have been some kind of deal that De Caen struck with the British. Oh, and just in reference to Trim, so this is what Flinders said of Trim. The best and most illustrious of his race, the most affectionate of friends, faithful of servants, and best of creatures. He made the tour of the globe and a voyage to Australia, which he circumnavigated, and was ever the delight and pleasure of his fellow voyagers. Yeah.
So he had named Australia at this point.
You raise a good point. So in his book and in his chart, which is published at the same time, he refers to Australia in that. Yes.
Oh, I see. I think it would be absolutely brilliant if the very first reference to the name Australia was in the eulogy for a cat. I just think, seriously, that would be priceless gold.
So 4 months later, Flinders finally arrives back in the UK. Yeah, his wife is still alive. He subsequently has a daughter with her. The problem was, though, that while Flinders was languishing on Mauritius, the account of Baudin's voyage had been published by his expedition's zoologist, Francois Perron, and that included a map that was put together by Freycinet.
Freycinet, absolutely, yeah. I mean, there's the peninsula and the bay and all that sort of jazz, yeah.
So it also has to be recognised that Baudin's expedition was itself an impressive achievement. He didn't circumnavigate Australia, but he explored about 2/3 of the coastline. It was scientifically fruitful. It was genuinely a scientific expedition. So there were quite a few scientists on board his ship, and they produced some beautiful illustrations, which Flinders didn't really do.
More of a map man than a
He was very much focused on getting that map sorted. But Freycinet put together a map that was very similar to Flinders. but Flinders had actually produced it first, but Freycinet and Perron got it published beforehand because, of course, they weren't stuck on Mauritius for 6 years. So when he discovered that, Flinders would have been bummed out, to say this.
His thunder was well and truly stolen.
It was. So, but he was promoted to captain, post-captain as it was called then. So that's equivalent to like a colonel in the army. And he spent the next 4 years trying to set the record straight with his magnum opus, A Voyage to Terra Australis. But his health was failing due to a bladder condition that was probably the result of gonorrhea he had contracted in Tahiti 20 years earlier.
Oh my God.
So this would have been before he got married. So as a result, Flinders died at the age of 40, which is very sad, on the 18th of July, 1814, the day after his book was published. So they actually put a copy of his book in his hands, but he was unconscious at the time, so he never got to see his book published.
What a tragedy.
Yeah.
His life's work, really. His biggest achievement.
Yeah. After the break, we'll talk a little bit about the map and about what the significance of that was. But first, Chris, I want to hear from you.
All right, Conan. Well, it's time for the intermission. I think since we've talked about the incredible successful voyage of Matthew Flinders, I thought I might just flip it around and talk about some of the worst navigators / explorers / bizarro facts in the exploration realm as a bit of a counterweight. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 3 stories. I'm going to start with the interesting case of King Abubakari II of Mali.
Oh,
right?
yes.
You know this one.
I've heard
You
of
know
him,
this
yeah.
one. Absolutely. Okay. So the king, or he became the emperor of Mali in the early 1300s, and that was when Mali was one of the richest kingdoms on the planet. Basically, it was incredibly wealthy. The king, or the emperor, I should say, always had this urge to explore. So he initiated this massive shipbuilding project where they built some 200 ships of all shapes and sizes because they weren't really sure what would be needed to cross these oceans, right? Big ships, sail ships, perhaps some guys were rowing boats, who knows? Anyway, and just release them into the Atlantic as a fact-finding mission, right?
Yeah.
One ship returned of the 200 ships, speaking of whirlpools and all sorts of nasty things hiding out there in the Atlantic. That did not deter the great emperor.
No.
He said, well, okay, we've made a bit of a start, now let's go hard. So he commissioned the construction of how many ships do you think, Conan?
More than 200.
More than 200.
Shot, let's say 500.
2,000 ships. He commissioned the construction of 2,000 ships, and he abdicated the throne, said, bugger it, we're going for this. He obviously boarded one of the ships, and they just took off across the Atlantic.
Really?
Never to be seen again, and that's the end of him. What an incredible story, though. A huge amount of effort. There are lots of rumours and stories and things made up about what actually happened. Whether they formed colonies in Brazil, and there's stories of African-looking people in South America and other places. So that's the big crazy effort of exploration. And now I'm going to move on to this more insane effort of exploration, and I'm going to be talking about someone called Salomon Auguste André. Okay, so this man, and he was around in sort of the mid 1800s and lived till the late 1800s. He was really interested in Arctic exploration. He's thinking, I just want to get up there and I just want to explore the ice, but I can't be bothered skiing. I know I've got a really efficient way to explore and map the Arctic. I'm going to throw it out to you, Conan. Have a guess. How do you think he wanted to do it?
Is this an aerial adventure?
I'm not going to say anything. It could be below the sea, above the sea. It could be all sorts of different things.
A balloon?
Yes, indeed it was. Very good, mate. Okay, so this man, Andre, we'll call him, actually owned a hydrogen-filled balloon. And he thought it would be a great idea to map it from the sky. Why wouldn't you?
Yeah.
And you do it in midsummer, which means you just cruise over the entire Arctic Ocean from one end to the other. You map away.
I can't see what could go wrong.
Nothing possibly could go wrong. Anyway, he got the Swedish monarch were keenly interested, and in fact supported this mission. And so there was a couple of issues with respect to his plans. One, he wasn't really a navigator.
Right.
Two, he had to wait till the prevailing winds were pushing him. But in 1897, he got on board with provisions and his crew, and they got into this hydrogen balloon and just went for it. Just disappeared off into the distance, over the ocean, over the ice, which is, it's a pretty amazing thought. What a visual. And on the way up, as of course you're entering icier conditions, you're getting ice kind of forming on things. They realised that their balloon was too heavy and kept dropping into the icy ocean, so they had to keep chucking stuff out of the balloon. So can you imagine this balloon just bobbing up and down all the way, and folk just throwing out their provisions and everything else in order to stay afloat? Anyway, after several crashes, they eventually just crashed for the final time, and they thought, oh well, we kind of expected this to happen anyway, so why don't we just get on our skis and whatever else, and we'll just start skiing to explore the Arctic. Of course, it kind of defeats the point of mapping the thing from the sky. And of course, they didn't have any provisions because they threw it all out, so they had to go shooting bears and anything else that they might find up there in order to keep them going. So anyway, the other issue was, because they did have all this kind of surveying equipment and so on, it actually broke the bottom of the sleds, so they couldn't drag the sleds across the ice. So this is where it gets serious. They built a home on this kind of ice floe in the hope of maybe being rescued, and it started to break up, and unfortunately by about 2 months after they started the expedition, they all perished, unfortunately. So a very, very sad ending to what is, in my mind, a kind of humorous expedition. Okay, so we're just going to go with one last explorer, and his name is, and you may have heard of him, is Perry Fawcett. Okay, so Perry Fawcett, he was a cartographer, worked for the National Geographic Society, and essentially he kind of spent a lot of time as a cartographer mapping parts of Brazil around the coast and so on. He heard rumours from sailors and so on that up there in the Amazon forest somewhere there was this magical city called the City of Z, right? And in fact, they made a film about this not that long ago, I think. He was renowned for being a bit of an exaggerator, right? I mean, he talked about seeing snakes that were like 16 metres long and all sorts of crazy stuff that no one really believed. But he did manage to get enough interest, enough support from the society to pursue these trips. And he went twice looking for the city of Zed, and on his second trip, he loaded up just a very small expedition with his son and who went with him and others, because he believed he could just go and make friends with the local Indian tribes, because he was a very lucky man. He had many kind of near misses with local tribes throughout his career, so he must have thought he was fairly charmed. I don't think that lasted to the end. Anyway, as he made his way into the Amazon, he telegraphed his wife in late, I think it must have been 1897, saying that you need have no fear of failure. And then they headed off into the forest, never to be seen again. But the really kind of strange, morbid kind of twist on all of this is that, he became a legend because he was looking for this lost city of Z. And up to kind of 100 other explorers followed him into the Amazon in the hope to find out what happened to him. He was a theosophist. So there was rumour maybe he'd started a cult up there in the forest versus just dying of a disease, which is most likely. And up to 100 other people who tried to find him also perished looking for the great Mr. Fawcett. So 3 examples of really not being good enough.
All teaching us the lesson really that, don't explore stuff. It rarely ends well. So it needs to be borne in mind that though Flinders, he was the first to circumnavigate Australia, the Dutch had done a lot. So from 1606, William Janszoon became the first European to map the Australian continent on the Doifken, as you were saying. And he mapped part of the west coast of Cape York, but he didn't know that it was separate from New Guinea at that point. So if you look at his map, it's really New Guinea and Australia. Same thing. Later that same year, Luis Vaz de Torres, the Portuguese navigator, navigated the strait that now bears his name. In 1616, Dirk Hartog becomes the first European to set foot on the shores of Western Australia, on Dirk Hartog Island. In fact, because he could see Australia from the island, he named it after his ship. He called it Indrachtland.
I'm glad that name didn't stick.
Yeah. And in fact, about 30 Dutch navigators explored the western and southern coasts of Australia in the 17th century alone. And famously, Abel Tasman in 1642 was the first European to discover Tasmania, although he didn't know it was an island. First European to discover New Zealand, Tonga, and parts of Fiji. And he charted the coast of what is now northern Western Australia, the Northern Territory, and the Gulf of Carpentaria.
Yeah, collective effort, really, wasn't it?
Yeah. Right. I mean, that combined with Cook's work, it meant that Flinders' map, he did fill in substantial gaps. And he put all of these maps together to create if you look at the map, and you can Google this, it's very accurate. But most importantly, he was able to show that Australia was a single continent. And he did all of this in a ship that was barely seaworthy for much of the voyage, while enduring, along with his crew, huge, serious privation, disease over extended periods. I mean, it's very hard to sort of, we can talk about it took him a year to get round, but I mean, that would have been a terrible year.
100%. Can you imagine? I mean, these ships were often quite crowded with crew, because you needed that many people to operate all the, the sails and all the bazillion ropes on the boat and everything else. And you need shifts through the night, of course, as well. But you're in a really confined space. Yeah. No privacy. It's incredibly cramped. Yeah. My hat goes off to anyone who survived those sorts of journeys. And that's after you'd made your way from Britain to Australia, which took 6 months or whatever the case is.
By the way, what was particularly galling for Flinders was that Freycinet, when he published his map, had chucked in a bunch of French place names on parts of Australia he knew Flinders had already mapped and named. So in the book he did publish, A Voyage to Terra Australis. And it's sort of a testament to the man that it pays tribute to the men who died on his vessel, to those who befriended him on Mauritius and kept him sane. And he shows an affinity with First Nations people in Australia too, who he encountered. And because the expedition proved that New South Wales in the east and New Holland in the west were two halves of one landmass, it was clear to Flinders that the continent needed a new name. And he labelled his map A Chart of Terra Australis, or Australia. Terra Australis obviously meaning southern land, which was in common usage at the time. But in fact, the term Australia had appeared in print before. It was used to describe the legendary southern landmass. It was thought to counterbalance the weight of the northern landmass that was Asia and Europe.
And do we know who named it
originally? Yes, so the earliest printing of the name appears on a world map in a German astronomical treatise published in 1545.
Brilliant.
Yeah. And the name appeared in English works 80 years later, and was used occasionally after that. But what we don't know is whether Flinders knew that. Whether he coined it himself or was repurposing it, we don't know. But what we do know is that because it appeared in that book, it then made its way to Australia. Lachlan Macquarie, my favourite New South Wales governor, got his hands on it and thought, yes, this is what we need to be calling this new landmass from now on. And so he introduced it into common parlance. And this was in about 1817. And by 1824, Britain had formally named the continent Australia. I mean, he didn't refer to Australia in the title of the book, but that was because Sir Joseph Banks, his patron, had prevailed on him not to. But he actually says elsewhere in the book, quote, "Had I permitted myself any innovation upon the original term Terra Australis, it would have been to convert it into Australia, as being more agreeable to the ear and as an assimilation to the names of the other great portions of the earth." So there you go, which, yes, he's right, it makes sense. Africa, Europa, Asia, America.
It gives it a continental name, doesn't
Exactly.
it? It really does.
We just finish off quickly with the quiz answers. So, yes, the cat was called Trim. The big cats are ligers, tigers, leopards and jaguars. And
ligers?
Yes.
We can't include a half-breed in the damn big cats.
I said lions, tigers, leopards.
You said ligers. You said ligers.
Did I say ligers?
Yes, you did say ligers.
For anyone who hasn't ever seen an image of a liger, for God's sake, Google it. It's nuts. It's larger than either of its parents. It's just a mammoth creature. What can the four big cats do that other cats can't? They can roar, Chris.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
That's brilliant.
Yes.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So while the other three big cats throttle their prey, jaguars sink their mighty fangs into the skull and therefore into the brain. But death is instant. So if you're going to choose a big cat...
Death by jaguar?
Death by jaguar is the way to go.
I'd take that.
Yeah.
I think.
And a mountain lion goes by two other names, Puma and...
Cougar?
Cougar.
Of course, that was the other one.
So yeah, next episode, Chris, we're going to be talking about Edith Cowan, who was
Edith Cowan. Edith Cowan.
She's the first woman to be elected to an Australian Parliament. So obviously this is for, you've got Western Australian friends who tune in?
Certainly do.
Well, they'll be thrilled. We will drop that ep on the 12th of March, which is the 102nd anniversary of her election win.
Fantastic. Timing is perfect, Conan. I'm really looking forward to the episode. Thank you, listeners. Please stay tuned to our Instagram account. We'll start popping out some pictures and maybe some funnies over the course of the next couple of weeks.
See you then. See you next time.